This conference is, as the title suggests, all about international trade and transportation. And it includes, as participants, people from all segments: importers, exporters, customs brokers, freight forwarders, ocean carriers, port authorities, and trucking companies, and so forth. So it is a general industry-based forum where we can really get into a lot of good issues. One of the primary issues, well, let me talk about both trade and transportation. So on trade, there are some opportunities out there, but also some challenges. The greatest opportunity is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trans-Pacific Partnership involving 11 countries around the Pacific Rim. And probably the most enticing would be the inclusion of Vietnam and the opportunity for importers, of which there were a number here at the conference, big brand name importers, to find alternative sourcing options for China. So alternative to China would be Vietnam, and Vietnam's in the negotiations. Thus far, our U.S. Trade Representative, the U.S. government, has not been as aggressive as the international trade community would like in working with the Vietnamese so that the Vietnamese would open up their markets to our insurance industry and other products we can sell to them, Caterpillar tractors and so forth, in return for significant reductions on import duties of footwear and apparel and reduced country of origin restrictions and so forth on the imports of textile and apparel into the United States. Should that develop into a real trade agreement and a real possible free trade agreement with the Pacific Rim, which includes all the countries except for China, it will greatly enhance the competitiveness of U.S. brands based here, will benefit U.S. consumers, and would dramatically increase traffic flows even above what they currently are for ocean carriers, for truckers, for railroads and ports between Asia and the United States. The volumes of trade would increase significantly. So that's one exciting opportunity, but frustrating until the U.S. government decides to really push for trade expansion and to open our markets to the Vietnamese exports.
There's a lot of discussion here about customs issues. What were some of the main topics that you heard?
Well, the most timely topic is the impact of sequestration, and sequestration is the mandate to reduce spending by civilian agencies anywhere between 5 and 7%. Initially, it was thought that the budget cuts would all be done based on personnel cuts. Since personnel in the federal government aren't fired, they were going to be furloughed. And that means 1 day or 2 days a month not coming to work and not being paid for it. There's no requirement in the law that the budget cuts have to come through personnel. It could be capital acquisition. The problem for customs is that they announced that they were going to terminate overtime and they were going to furlough inspectors, which means that you would have almost immediately bollocksed up the transportation flow and the trade flows for the busy ports, LA, Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, and so forth, the busiest ports. This would be almost the equivalent of a strike, of a labor strike, and shutting the ports, because almost instantaneously you would not be able to move containers off the ships, off the terminals. Ships would be held at bay, and the railroads wouldn't be able to come in with any more cargo. It would be a disaster. Two things that showed of interest. Overtime is actually paid for by the merchandise processing fee, which is paid for by the importers. And so nobody was suggesting the importers would stop paying the merchandise processing fee, so the funding for the overtime was continuing in. In addition, as well, importers often pay for that overtime, not only for customs, but for the Food and Drug Administration inspectors and so forth, so they pay for it. So there really was no reason to announce a cutting of overtime, because the revenue flow to pay for it was going to continue. But even so, under direction from the White House, and this is a new direction because just yesterday President Obama announced that he was going to take a personal 5% pay cut. That's really the way the private sector reduces personnel costs, reduces pay. And yesterday, CBP announced in a directive to the field that they have been given a direction and permission by the Office of Management and budget to find some more flexibility in the ways to achieve the sequester cuts, which may not require furloughing and cutting of overtime. So that's still a question out there, but we're very encouraged that Customs is looking for some way other than eliminating overtime and eliminating inspectors in order to meet their sequester goals. That will allow trade to continue to flow. Very encouraging. We will know better maybe by April 15, 16, whether there will be real cuts or whether those will be deferred.
Looking at the transportation scene, what do you see as the top issues affecting CONECT members in the next year or so?
Well, we're past the possibility of a labor strike, port labor strike on the East Coast. We are now about 14 months or even less away from the expiration of the West Coast port labor contract. So people are nervous. Since 10 years ago, when that West Coast port labor contract expired, we ended up with a port strike or a port shutdown that lasted for I think 8 to 10 days. So therefore people are already nervous about that. Another issue, and it's one that on everybody's minds here, is the growth of the Canadian and potentially of the Mexican ports of entry as a way to flow cargo from Asia into the United States. This is raising concerns from ports of LA and Long Beach all the way to Seattle and Tacoma and Oakland as to whether they will permanently lose that cargo flow to Prince Rupert, Vancouver, the Mexican ports. Maersk has announced a massive financial commitment to build that Mexican port. The rail link is very good into Laredo, Texas, and into the United States. So the question is, how are those existing trade flows to U.S. ports going to be maintained or not? And the question has emerged, will our U.S. railroads contribute to protecting the trade flows through U.S. ports? Because we concluded that it's really the railroads that determine the trade flows, and if the Canadian railroad or a Mexican railroad is lower cost, more user-friendly than the Burlington Northern or UP in the perception of some of the importers and the steamship lines, well, those cargoes will start shifting, and we've seen that in the Prince Rupert to the upper Midwest of the United States flows.
So surface transportation has got to become a more prominent issue in international trade.
And trucking as well. And trucking will impact domestic and international. You know, if you got it, a truck brought it, they say. And that's true for international cargo as well as domestic movements. We are facing the imposition of new hours of service regulations sometime this summer, depending on the status of litigation at that time. But those new hours of service regulations are estimated to increase the demand for drivers by approximately 9 to 11%. And at a time when we already have a capacity crunch in available trucking capacity and truck driver availability, to face this sort of cut in availability of trucks and drivers is definitely a concern to anybody who has to move merchandise. Also, as the economy is improving, truck drivers are getting out of the cab and getting to work in house construction, home construction, the fracking industry in North Dakota and so forth, all these places where they perceive the jobs may be more desirable than truck driving. So new hours of service regulations coming in at a time of already limited truck capacity at a time when the economy is improving could spell real disaster for everyone that is involved with cargo movement, and it'll hit this summer.